All right, I'm going to formally start us off now. So again, this is Paul Kovacs with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. Thank you to everybody who's joined us right on time here. We do have a few others who are signed up, so we might see more joining us as we get into the session today. The Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction run a series of webinars and workshops on a host of issues. This is the first time we've done a session on climate disclosure, finance, and litigation. We're delighted to see so many signing up and participating today, and we have an outstanding group of speakers to talk with you. So thank you for joining us. Please keep an eye on the topics that we have going forward. We do this once a month, Friday forum. So Friday afternoon, this is a place you can come and join us each month if you're interested. Let me jump into today's session because we have a large area to cover in a relatively short period of time. I'm going to speak first, and then my colleagues will share their views, and then there'll be time for questions afterward. In terms of process, we're going to show the camera of the speaker going forward, but for most of you, we'll have your cameras off just because we have a large number of people today. We have some slides we'll be putting up for you. There is a period for questions at the end. The time is going to go very quickly for questions. So along the way, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button and raise the questions. The panelists will watch for an opportunity to see if they can answer you directly as the session is unfolding. And I will try to pick from that in terms of bringing some questions at the end of the session before we have to wrap down. Okay, so let me jump in. Bohan, can you take it to the first slide? So again, we've done more than 200 of these webinars over the years. This is the first time we've had 6 speakers all at the same time because the topic requires many different perspectives. And I'm so proud of the team that's here and going to talk with you. So again, I'm Paul Kovacs. The next speaker will be Gordon McBean, then Gord Beal, Maryam Golnaraghi, Pat Koval, and then Bohan Li. I don't want to use all the time to introduce each of our speakers today. I hope that they can quickly talk a little bit about their background and what they do during their sessions. Just an outstanding group of climate scientists, of specialists who really understand the area of climate disclosure, climate finance, and climate litigation. So I'm so proud that this is a team that we've had a chance to work together. We're going to share some of what we found. Next slide, please. So today we're going to do first a presentation by me. I'm going to talk about the Canadian climate assessment process. We'll do a short introduction that'll come from Gordon McBean on the broad changing issue of climate disclosure, finance, and litigation. Then we will have Gord Beal talk about the disclosure and some of the latest developments on disclosure and our key findings. Then Maryam will talk about the finance side of some of the key developments happening there. Pat will talk about litigation, and then Bohan will share some of what we found in terms of research opportunities and some of the gaps as we went through our work. So this is what we're going to cover today. Next slide, please. So starting with me doing the climate assessment. Thank you, Bohan. Canada is a leader in climate science, and in particular, a leader in the assessment of climate science. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Gordon and I have been part of that process for quite a long time, has won the Nobel Peace Prize for the quality of some of the UN type work. The Canadian work is equal in quality throughout. This is a process that brings together the Canadian climate science community, formally assesses what we know, in particular what we've learned recently, and documents that and gets it out so it's relevant for a broad audience. The climate assessment process in Canada is unrivaled in the world. It's just a remarkable process. Some of us have given our time to this for quite a while just because of the importance and how incredibly it's well managed and processed. It's been done by Natural Resources Canada. The second phase in this report, last year in the climate change report, we learned that the climate is warming in Canada twice as fast as the rest of the world. The second phase of that report will be coming out very soon, and you're going to see part of it today as an advance look. Next slide, please. The process used in Canada, multi-dimensional, multi-year. It's a long process. So the writing team you have with us here today, we've been working for several years to come to what is our part of this overall report. Altogether, there were dozens and dozens of authors who contributed to the document. Many other reviewers and scientists reviewed the process. A very rigorous, complex process that leads to just the best quality findings to summarize what we know, what policy relevant, useful information we can learn out of the climate research to help advance Canada to be better prepared. Next slide, please. Again, lots of people involved. We had a process that is just unrivaled in terms of bringing people at different levels to allow their expertise to write the specifics of each chapter, to make sure that it fits into an overall package that works, proper editing so that the findings are relevant. For all of us who are all volunteers, are so proud that we are able to contribute and be part of this overall exercise. Next slide, please. The reports last year, Canada's Changing Climate Report came out. This was the report to say Canada's warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. The North, it's even faster. The report about to come out, it's been underway since 2017. It'll come out in the next couple of weeks. It will come in part as a national issues report. This writing team were part of the national issues report, and will also come out as a regional perspectives report. While last year's report focused on what was happening to our climate, this year is talking about the impact on our climate, on our society of change in the climate. Later this year, there'll be a report on health as part of this second phase, with some follow-up material coming next year dealing specifically with the Indigenous resilience issues and some further synthesis of what we can learn by looking across all of this work. So again, a commitment starting way back in 2016, looking right across all of the emerging science to put it into a form that will be helpful to everybody. So watch in the next couple of weeks. You're getting a special preview today of one part of the report that's about to be released. Next slide, please. So again, the point of the National Issues Report, published by the Government of Canada through hundreds of volunteers from the science and expert community, is to understand the impact of climate change, issues related to adaptation. This is the report we're doing this year, building on the science from last year. It's coming out soon. And this will help us understand what climate change means for everyone in Canada, how it's going to affect our lives, what we can do about it, where we're making some progress, what we still need to do, and what are some of the key issues. And you'll see our presentation today, we have identified a small number of key issues that we found relevant for climate disclosure, finance, and liability that we're going to highlight for you today. Next slide, please. So the overall paper that's coming out in just a couple of weeks' time, there's 9 chapters in the National Issues Report, and then the second part of the report will focus on the different regions of Canada. And today's presentation is focusing on Chapter 8 of the 9, Climate Disclosure, Litigation and Finance. And the entire writing team is here with you today, so you'll get to hear from everybody directly in their own words what it is that the team found with respect to these issues. We are so excited to be able to contribute to this year's National Issues Report because these topics have never been part of a Government of Canada report before. These issues have been building over time. There have been previous reports that dealt with issues like water, and the newest report will update all of that. But this is the first time in a Canadian report we have looked at the literature, the science, the recent developments with respect to the important issue of climate disclosure, litigation, and finance, and been able to pull that together for a much broader community. There's a narrow community that's been on top of this for a while, but this will be, we're really excited to be able to bring this to a broader community today. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was a quick introduction of the broader framing of all of this. We have a team here that's going to talk about climate disclosure, finance, and litigation. This fits into an overall national process to try to bring to the public, to decision makers across Canada, in government, the private sector, homeowners, what is happening, and allow each of the members of this team to share in their own words what we found from this process. So first, Gordon McBean is going to talk about an overall introduction to the topic. Gordon, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. If we could have my next slide, please, or the first slide of mine. Just to say that we do have in this situation a large number of climate-related risks and opportunities, which are projected to increase over time. And as we are recognizing, as the key message here is that climate change risks and opportunities are a business issue. And as we move ahead, we want to contribute to the transition to a resilient and low carbon economy. Now, I often use to put these things in context, the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Landscape of 2020. That's what's on the screen here in front of you, in which they rank issues and risks basically by terms of their impact and their likelihood. So the things in the upper right-hand corner are the ones of high likelihood and high impact. And if we can have the next click. The top two up there are what is called climate action failure, or failure to take action on climate change, including mitigation, emission reductions, and climate change adaptation. And the one of highest likelihood is the continuing risks of extreme weather events. There's also biodiversity loss, natural disasters, and other environmental issues. This report was written and released in January 2020. And if we can have the next one, in January 2021, they put out their new report, which of course is now in the situation of the COVID and the pandemic situation, where they moved infectious diseases from being a less likely and low impact to a higher impact, and not quite as likely yet, though, as climate action failure and extreme weather events. They also actually ramped up the importance, the impact of the failure of climate change action. So we're in a new situation. If we can go to the next slide, please. So there, the next click. That's good right there. Just to say that we in the actions in a pandemic recovery, we have to recognize, as the UN Secretary General said last year, that pandemic recovery is our chance to change the course in the way we're addressing climate change. And the Prime Minister, speaking last year, also talked about the need to take decisive and ambitious actions for a cleaner, healthier, and more resilient planet. And these things are so important. So if we just click to say that the important thing is climate finance, and we'll come on back to that one later in the discussion. Sorry, go ahead, next. As we said, that climate change risks and opportunities are business issues. And interestingly, a group of business-related people, the Task Force on Resilient Recovery in 2020, talked about a very important activity of investing in climate resilient and energy efficient buildings to address the climate change issue in recovery from the COVID situation. And just to say that we can click next, that building climate resilient communities is the focus of a report that myself, Paul Kovacs, Jamie Voot, Greg Kopp, and about 20 some other authors have put together, in which we looked at the issues of disaster risk, hazardous events, but also the vulnerability and exposure of communities within the context of the risks of failure to take action on climate change, extreme weather, and infectious diseases. And just quickly looked at urban health and environments, urban infrastructure next, indigenous communities and health, human health and resilience, and next, the economics of climate change adaptation, barriers to adaptation, and how these can come together in a national adaptation strategy. And the federal government, click next, has already put out what's called a healthy environment and a healthy economy. This came out in December 2020, in which it focused on things like making places Canadians live and gather more affordable by cutting energy waste. Next, making clean and affordable transportation and power available to every community, continue to ensure pollution isn't free and households get more money back. And next, building Canada's clean industrial advantage and embracing the power of nature to support healthier families and more resilient communities. These issues are ones that we think are all need to be part of the response of both the business community and others. And it really relates to the key messages which will be talked about by my colleagues again on, for example, key message 2 on climate change climate-related disclosure and how that drives action, etc. So next slide, please. Just wanted to say, as I mentioned, that we are expecting to see coming out, or at least started on now, Canada's first ever national adaptation strategy. There's been attempts to do it before, but never fully completed. And the idea is to bring together all levels of governance, Indigenous people and other partners for a shared vision of a climate resilience in Canada. And for this, we want to see support will be provided to Canadians and communities so they can respond to these accelerating climate change impacts. Minister McKenna next spoke very importantly about this from the point of view of infrastructure, about good jobs and things. And as we take the same approach to the climate crisis as we are to COVID-19, urgency, science-based decisions, working together across borders and focusing on the planet we want for everyone, we will win the race against climate too, as she put it. Next. The Auditor General of Canada, when reviewing the COVID situation, spoke about the importance of needing credible and timely risk assessments to provide effective responses, and also important to have effective national surveillance frameworks and early warning systems for public health threats as being very important, all of these being important. I just wanted to emphasize that when we talk about climate change, there is a very strong overlap in the need for these kind of actions, risk assessments, surveillance frameworks, effective early warning systems, so we can inform and where appropriately really warn Canadians about changing events and risks, and also about opportunities and things as we've talked about in terms of the climate change risks and opportunities are business and societal issues, as it says on the bottom of the screen. The last point I'll just mention, next, is that the Supreme Court, in ruling on the carbon tax issue, spoke about global warming causing harm beyond provincial boundaries. And it, I think, makes important the issues of multi-level governance arrangements to address climate-related events, such as flooding, issues to do with weather crossing provincial and international boundaries, and how we should be able to provide advice and guidance for appropriate community actions. So I think just to say, to conclude, that we need to bring out also how this relates to the other messages in the whole issue. Next. There's one more click there that's supposed to show up. Oh, there it is. The whole question of climate change litigation, which will again be discussed by my colleagues, but how these things relate across the issues and how they relate geographically. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I hope we'll be able to continue this dialogue for the years to come as will be necessary to implement all of this. And just remember, climate change risks and opportunities are business and societal issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. A pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me, and also not to have those problems. I'm going to turn my camera off. I just wanted to say hello and deliver the speech. So, this whole flow from disclosure to finance, disclosure would be foundational to enable investors and the government make good decisions in investing towards a resilient low carbon economy. However, transitioning to a climate resilient low carbon economy, if you can go to the next slide, Bohan, please, requires significant investments in Canada and globally. And these investments need to be made in both adaptation and mitigation measures, which need to happen together in alignment and in an integrated approach. And essentially, if we don't take that in that holistic way, we might actually face a time when cost of adaptation might be so high and prohibitive. So one of our big messages in this report is that we really need to think in a much more integrated way around adaptation and mitigation. And the situation in Canada is that traditionally adaptation and mitigation have been addressed in silos. And even if we look at the Pan-Canadian framework, which does provide a national framework for Canada's approach towards greening and building resilience, still that integrated approach, the importance of adaptation and mitigation, as part of that transitioning may not have been stressed. And when you look at the work and the final report of the expert panel on sustainable finance, you see that in this report, there is a lot more stress on thinking about a more integrated approach as well. Now, and I want to stress that our findings really stresses a lot on the work that was done by the expert panel on sustainable finance in their final report, trying to really bring together fundamental issues that allow Canada in making its transitioning with this concept of resilience as well as greening of our economy. Now, when you think about how the world is investing in adaptation and mitigation, in the figure that you see here, essentially, you see that both private and public sector are investing, almost like it's been slightly more on the private sector side than the public side. And this is a very important message that we have tried to raise in our report, that the investment gap is so huge that public funding will not be sufficient, and funds need to be raised from the private sector to really address the gap, again, in Canada and internationally. And again, this investment needs to happen on a variety of different areas. And up to now, when we look at where the investments are focused, you know, there is a lot more investment, again, going into mitigation than adaptation, but this seems to be slightly shifting internationally. Now, one of the key issues that we raised in our report is what are the main hurdles for private investors in supporting the transitioning to a resilient low carbon economy. And I'd just like to highlight 4 points that we detail out in the report. First is around political and public policy uncertainty associated with transitioning, the fact that, you know, there is a lack of cohesive national strategy and clear climate change policy, regulatory and legislative processes. Although in Canada, with the latest ruling, at least the issue around carbon pricing is starting to get more, more clarity, yet the issue around government subsidies and so on still remains a hurdle. Need for a taxonomy and establishing green as an asset class, defining resilience so that investors have more clarity in what they are investing and more standards around that. Very importantly, need for data, tools, methodologies, and expertise to assess investability of a project around risks. And then finally, importance of regulatory issues, for example, issues related to higher capital charges associated with long-term investing and higher risk investments. So we go into some of these issues and what is the status of that in Canada. Now, we also have identified the various financing mechanisms that are emerging in enabling private and public investors to invest in this area. We have highlighted 4 types of bonds: green bonds, sustainability bonds, catastrophe bonds, and the newly developed transition bonds, and essentially what are the characteristics of these bonds, how they can be used. But nevertheless, still, when you look at these kind of financing approaches, the principle behind these bonds and how we monitor them to ensure that the funds raised are actually going towards what they were intended needs to be addressed. One point I want to raise, that particularly on green bonds, which are the most popular bonds so far, you still see that while these type of bonds are designed for financing of green and resilience projects, up to now, you see a very small percentage of green bonds are actually being applied for adaptation and resilience projects, but there is a movement towards creation of taxonomy and definitions so that these type of bonds could be also focused more in that areas. We also have detailed financing mechanisms for infrastructure system, because I think as Gordon raised in his part, financing resilient infrastructure and thinking about how within the existing infrastructure in Canada, we can build climate resilience through retrofits and other things. That's going to be costly. And the question becomes, as Canada invests in future infrastructure systems, is resilience also accounted as part of the principles that's going to be driving project design? And also, how do you really think about the whole life cycle of an infrastructure and think about the risks associated with climate, factoring those in, pricing it, and allocating it so that the project could become more desirable? If you can go please to the next slide.
Maryam,
Now,
that's Paul, you've got 3 minutes.
Absolutely, thank you, Paul. So in the next slide, we actually talk about why investment in climate risk reduction builds resilience and it's cost effective. As part of this report, we essentially try to outline a more cohesive approach to resilience around need for investing in risk assessment and risk communication and awareness across society, need for investing in risk reduction and risk prevention, things to do with building codes and land zoning and a variety of others. We stress that there has been a lot of investments in early warning system and linked to emergency preparedness, but linking early warnings beyond just saving lives to saving property needs to be realized. And we spent a lot of time in this report on really highlighting the critical role of insurance industry in working with the government and other stakeholders in the society around the issue of resilience. And we have focused on some of the great work that the insurance industry in Canada has done, for example, with respect to setting up centers of excellence, such as ICLR, such as Intact Center for Climate Adaptation, or Partners for Action, as well as the whole innovation and working with government around reforming areas such as flood risk management with Insurance Bureau of Canada. These are not only great practices in Canada, but by working internationally, I can say that Canada is really moving in great direction that could be also an example for the world. And we really need to build on these relationships and enable that. If you can just go to the last slide, and I just want to highlight 3 points and I will be done. Beyond the drafting of this report, there are a number of other developments that I just want to raise your attention to. First of all, growing trend among financial institutions and insurance companies in Canada in investing in data and analytics, actively engaging in international initiatives to develop methodologies for climate risk assessment. Also, our financial sector is now actively working with OSFI and Bank of Canada in designing climate risk assessment and scenarios for financial sector. A recent report that we published working with the leading experts in Canada on flood risk assessment that really captures how Canada is addressing these issues. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but we are also making some headways through big partnerships. But there are also 2 developments that I want to raise for Canadian concern. One is example of Government of UK having set up a center for climate risk analytics funded by the government with support of the financial sector, which very much resembles recommendation 4 of our expert panel on sustainable finance and could be used as a model. And then finally, the whole structuring of net zero transitioning pertaining to the role of private sector and leveraging that with public sector is now under review through World Economic Forum, a body of work that I think in Canada we need to take a close look at because that's going to be foundational in how we can enable the transitioning. And with that, thank you so much. And I pass it on to you, Paul.
Maryam, thank you. That was excellent. So we're going to do Pat next, and then we're going to back to Gord, and then we'll do Bohan at the end. And my apologies, one of the administrative things I was supposed to do at the very beginning for everybody, we are recording this session. And ICLR posts a recording of each of our sessions a few days after the event, so that if you have any friends who missed this and you want to tell them to watch it, you can go to the ICLR website and be able to watch this all again, which we look forward to. Anyway, Pat, over to you to talk about litigation, please.
Okay, thank you, Paul. First of all, my name's Pat Koval. I'm a corporate lawyer by background, and that was my profession until I formally retired in 2016. But I've been involved in the areas of climate change, carbon finance, and biodiversity for probably more than 20 years and continue that active involvement. Currently, I'm actually a corporate director by profession. I sit on the boards of a number of Canadian and American companies. I'm now going to follow Maryam's example. I'm going to turn my camera off just to hope I'm appeasing the internet gods here. Okay, so Bohan, if we could have the first slide. Okay, just to start off, climate litigation is litigation in which climate change and its impacts are a key or a contributing consideration. For publication purposes, we had a cutoff of September 30th in our report, but I'm going to update that discussion fully for you today. So you're getting a little bit of an add-on to our report. Some of you may be wondering, why is litigation important? Isn't it just the laws that the Canadian government passes that we should be focused on? And the short answer to that is no. Litigation is obviously important for parties that get directly involved in it, but from a bigger perspective, it's the source of most law in Canada. In our country, which follows what is known as the common law system, there's two sources of law: statutes and judge-made law. Legal cases that are ruled on by judges make up by far the biggest component of the law in Canada. And so that's why litigation is important for those who are watching the climate space. Looking at our first slide, what's clear today is that there's significant litigation in Canada already against governments and their agencies. I think you can see that from the pictorial. Broadly speaking, it falls into three different categories. The first is litigation that's intended to compel government action on climate. The second is litigation that's seeking to change government actions, or more frequently, to change approvals or decisions that governments have made. And the third is litigation relating to failure to adapt infrastructure to increasingly foreseeable physical risk. The volume of litigation today is basically highest, I would say, certainly for category 1, and has the most media visibility in category 1, followed then by category 2 and category 3. So if we can move to the second slide, what does the Canadian litigation landscape look like today? And I mean literally today. First thing that's important to note is that the Canadian courts at the highest levels have recognized that climate change exists and that it has an anthropogenic origin. We have the constitutional cases on the federal carbon pricing legislation to thank for those statements. And I emphasize that they're important statements, not just at the Supreme Court of Canada, which called climate change an existential issue, but also very important statements from the decisions of the courts in Saskatchewan and in Ontario. Right now, there's currently a suite of 4, I would say, very important cases before our courts in which the plaintiffs are mostly NGOs or non-governmental organizations, youth plaintiffs, and in the most recently brought case, the plaintiffs are 2 BC-based First Nations. The plaintiffs in all of those cases, I'm just going to make a generalization here, are asking the courts in Canada to make several key findings. First, they're asking the courts to establish that governments, and I mean federal, provincial, municipal, have a legal duty, both under our common law, as well as our Canadian Constitution, to take action to protect the environment. This is something that's known in the United States as the public trust doctrine, but it's never been recognized by Canadian courts. The second thing they're seeking is to have courts establish that the federal government has a constitutional duty to make laws to protect its citizens from climate change or from the negative effects of climate change. For those of you who follow constitutional law matters, their argument is that that duty is a duty to make laws under the peace, order, and good government power. You will have, those of you who've read the Supreme Court of Canada ruling on the carbon pricing legislation will see that that power got referred to effectively as the basis for the decision. The last thing the plaintiffs in these 4 seminal cases are claiming is that the Canadian Charter of Rights contains a right to a stable climate system. One case was brought in Quebec against the Canadian government and focuses on both the Canadian Charter of Rights and also the Quebec Charter of Rights, which has some slightly different wording than the Canadian Charter. Another case was brought in Ontario against the Ontario government, and the other 2 cases were brought directly against the federal government in federal courts. Basically, all of the plaintiffs in these cases are asking for the courts to require governments to take action where they believe there's been inaction on the government's part. The case brought by the First Nations in federal court, however, also makes the argument that governments have taken action that is in breach of the rights that they are asserting. And how have they breached that? They breached it, they are saying, by approving new GHG emitting infrastructure projects. So where do these cases stand today? Effectively, all are ongoing, and they're all now in higher courts of appeal, on appeal from decisions at first instance at lower courts. Both the federal court cases were struck down by the lower court at first instance, but are now on appeal to the Federal Court of Appeal. One of them, the case that was brought by 2 BC-based First Nations, is expected to be heard by the Federal Court of Appeal in the fall of this year. The other, which is known as the LaRose case, which is brought by 15 young Canadian plaintiffs, just filed an opening brief on its appeal to the Federal Court of Appeal on May 3rd, just over 2 weeks ago. And there is some expectation that that will also be heard later this year. The Quebec case, which was the first of the 4, and which was also brought by a youth-based NGO, was brought, and this is technical, it was brought as a class action, and it was struck down at the lower court for very technical reasons related to the process rules around how you can and how you cannot frame a class. The lower court, however, gave the plaintiffs hope by saying that questions of alleged violation of the federal and Quebec Charters of Rights are issues that can properly be brought before the courts. In other words, they're not purely legislative or political in nature. And why that's important is because in Canada, the law makes a clear distinction between what is the purview of legislators and what's the purview of courts. Anything that is exclusively the purview of legislators is not for the courts and is not, and as such is referred to as not being justiciable. The Quebec plaintiffs appealed that very technical decision, seeking to have the case move ahead. That appeal was actually heard in on February 23rd of this year, and the decision is expected to be released later this year. The Ontario court, the case, which is known as the Mather case, and which has had a lot of media attention, particularly in Ontario, scored an initial victory at the lower court level. The court there refused the province's motion to dismiss it for failing to disclose a proper cause of action. In fact, what the Ontario Superior Court said is that the current government's action in changing laws related to climate that were made by the previous government were those decisions and how they were made would in fact be reviewable under the Charter of Rights. That decision is now under appeal by the government of Ontario. So we have basically 4 really important cases, all of which I think we're expecting to hear from the courts of appeal on later this year. Now let me come back to our slide. Elsewhere in the litigation landscape, there have of course been a slew of cases focused on governmental approvals or permits for infrastructure projects. I don't think I need to go into any detail on the number of cases which focused on the Trans Mountain extension of the pipeline. Those cases have ultimately been decided by the Supreme Court of Canada. But there are a few other cases on other matters that are still outstanding. With respect to a failure to adapt infrastructure, as I'm sure many of you in the audience are aware, there have been and continue to be a number of cases against municipalities, conservation authorities, and provincial watershed managers alleging negligence for failure to adapt infrastructure in light of increasingly foreseeable physical risks and impacts of climate change. But here I would just say briefly, those cases face challenges because the governments have defenses if they can demonstrate that the decisions they made were purely policy decisions. In other words, they really related to legislative powers as opposed to operational decisions. And in other cases, there are actual statutes which render immunity to governments for certain types of actions. So at this point in time, we're certainly aware of the 2019 Quebec spring flood cases that are still continuing and a few others, but they all turn on their facts. And I don't think we can expect to see any major pronouncements that are going to vary given that established law. The last slide I'm going to touch on just very briefly, because I know we're going to be short of time, and that is with respect to the private sector. As far as litigation against private sector parties goes, the Canadian landscape's been pretty quiet. In our chapter, we highlight a number of areas, though, where we know that organizations and their boards of directors are aware of potential risk. And when I say that we know this, I can also say this personally as a director of a number of corporations in which climate change is an issue. The first risk is for publicly traded companies. Gord is going to talk a little bit about the duty that publicly traded companies have to disclose material risks of any sort. There are no Canadian cases right now ongoing in this context that focus on climate risk disclosure. The second risk, though, and the second category, which is I would call the sexy category, particularly given the amount of attention that the media has given it, are the cases that basically, or the issues around alleging that fossil fuel companies have corporate responsibility for climate change. In the US and in Europe, there's a lot of litigation against companies known as the carbon majors. You'll see in this chart that research has been done showing just how much of global emissions can be accounted for by a select number of companies. And those carbon majors, who are usually the major oil and gas producers, coal, and natural gas companies, are generally all embroiled in litigation, particularly in the US, in which effectively municipalities, states, counties are basically saying you're responsible, your products cause climate change, and we have massive bills to basically either refit or rebuild our infrastructure and to make major capital improvements, and you should pay for it. The US has been quite a sideshow over the past few years. Over 20 cases have been filed, and there seems to be a development every month as these cases make their way through the courts. But importantly, there have been no such cases brought in Canada, although the topic is known to have been discussed by some municipalities, but no municipality, no private organization has so far brought a case of this nature in this country. Last issue, and just touch on it very briefly, and this is one that's probably well known to most of the people on this call, and that is the risk of negligence or nuisance cases against private sector infrastructure owners and design professionals. This is actually a subject that Paul and I have spoken at various venues about for many, many years. In fact, going back, I think 15 years. This, interestingly, has also been a quiet area in Canada, at least litigation-wise. And here, I think I would venture to say that perhaps the reason for that is that private sector parties have been made aware and have become aware for some years now of climate risks and physical risks in particular, and the damage that can be done as a result of infrastructure failure. And I think it's probably fair to say that many of those infrastructure owners and certainly design professionals are taking action to limit their risks in this regard. And that may be the reason for the lack of litigation in the area. So with that, I will stop and let Paul and Bohan turn over to Gord.
Thank you, Pat. And a recognition, Pat is the first one to talk about our topic being sexy. So thank you very much, Pat. That's really important. Bohan, can I have you return to Gord Beal's slides? And Gord, thank you for your perseverance through the technology here. But over to you, Gord, to talk about climate disclosure.
Paul, can you hear me okay? Is this
I can hear you really
working
clearly.
okay?
Thank you. All good.
Excellent, excellent. Well, my apologies again for the lack of support of my internet today, even though most days it's just fine. If for some reason today it decided not to. So thanks everybody for your patience, and I'm going to dive into the climate-related disclosure section now, fairly quickly now, to save some time. So looking at disclosure, and it's been alluded to through the previous sessions of the previous elements of the presentation by both Maryam and Pat. But disclosure is important for a variety of reasons. It's certainly key to it is it enables stakeholders to assess an organization and make informed decisions. Various stakeholders include investors, shareholders, lenders, insurers, the regulators themselves, as well as employees and consumers. And of course, for public sector and government organizations, that includes voters and the decisions that they will make. It provides the information to help those decision-making and be able to move forward. It informs what organizations are actually doing in terms of climate action. In addition, it can facilitate the development of a coherent and credible public policy process because it enables insight as to how organizations are addressing these issues. Disclosure also allows the markets to better assess which entities can manage the risk and seize the opportunities in a low carbon economy and resilience to physical and transition risks that are associated with that climate change. So disclosure is a very powerful vehicle through which it can actually impact that process. Specific disclosure important for investor decision making include issues around risks related to physical location and infrastructure, as Maryam alluded to earlier, water information where critical dependencies exist, trends and measures to reduce GHG emissions. Disclosure is certainly a key piece. For disclosure in Canada, there are some elements that are very much a mandatory element of disclosure. For publicly traded companies, it's a requirement by provincial securities laws to disclose information regarding all material risks it faces. And the key there is material risks. The Canadian Securities Administrators, which are the regulators, have a staff notice, in fact, that deals specifically with reporting of climate change-related risks, and it assesses it in the context of materiality. And I'll talk a little bit about materiality in a moment. The kind of disclosure around commitments, events, risks or uncertainties, those kinds of risks that the company reasonably believes will materially affect its future performance should be disclosed. Also for publicly accountable enterprises in Canada, the International Financial Reporting Standards, which are the standards under which corporations report financial results more broadly. Although climate change risk is not explicitly referenced in it, in an article by one of the Standards Board members themselves, it indicated that climate change risk is addressed because fundamentally anything material needs to be disclosed within that context. And this is important. It keeps bringing it back from a mandatory point of view to that materiality element. The quality and quantity of climate-related disclosure has improved over time, but it continues to be inconsistent and difficult to compare. And this is based on research that CPA Canada conducted just last year. So there's certainly opportunities for improvement in this space. So just to talk for a moment about the materiality element, material risks include severe weather events, slow onset events that might result in damage to assets, personal injury, operational disruptions, employee problems, or even supply chain or customer distribution disruptions. There are risks related to climate-related regulations that are increasingly potentially going to be emerging through this process. Reputational issues, including employees and investor attitudes. And ultimately even business model or strategy changes that relate, for example, to changes in demands for products or services, the availability of renewable energy, or the development of energy efficient products. Financial impacts, including asset write-offs, capital expenditures, increased costs and reduced revenues, are also areas that need to be looked at in the context of what materially could impact that organization and what needs to be included in those climate-related disclosures. The CSA notice contains principles for issuers seeking to make materiality determinations and urges companies to err on the side of disclosure when in doubt. It really is pushing towards enhancing the whole disclosure process. That said, beyond mandatory disclosure, some Canadian companies are voluntarily disclosing climate change information that they may not even consider to be material for securities law. And this is important because as there are expectations for increased disclosure, there are opportunities to disclose on a voluntary basis. In addition, in the public sector side of things, some Canadian cities and municipal governments are also now producing voluntary climate-related reports. The benefits of this, as I alluded to earlier, are multiple. Certainly many stakeholders, including investors, as I mentioned earlier, employees, customers, the insurers. But for government and public sector organizations, that voter piece is important because voters may ultimately, and very likely will, make decisions based on the kind of information they're getting about how government organizations are addressing this issue. Key on the voluntary disclosure piece is a framework that arguably is the most common voluntary reporting framework these days, and it's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, as I'll refer to TCFD. TCFD has been endorsed by the Government of Canada for Crown corporations, and in fact, as a disclosure framework, has become a condition for companies receiving COVID-19 financial support. This is important because organizations are being asked to provide more information. And so this voluntary framework is really critical. Also of note, the expert panel on sustainable finance recommended its adoption by all Canadian companies. So this challenge of disclosure is very significant. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the context of the TCFD. So perhaps we can go to the next slide now. This slide provides a little bit of insight on the framework.
Paul, just a reminder, 3 minutes.
3 minutes, I'll finish up quickly. Thanks, Paul. The TCFD fundamentally is asking for disclosure in 4 key areas. The governance, in terms of how organizations are fundamentally governing the climate-related risks and opportunities. The strategy, how strategy and the management of risks are being embedded in the organization's business strategy and the planning. The risk management side, most specifically, is a key part of the disclosure, and then the importance of the metrics and targets. I also want to point out here that there are recommendations within the framework that looks at the use of scenario analysis, and it really does recommend that the reporting material climate-related information in financial disclosures is included. What's really important in the context of this chapter is the challenge of the scenario analysis is significant. And so what my hope is, our hope is through this chapter, is it opens up to the range of climate-related data that's available for organizations to use in looking at assessing and determining some of the scenarios that they may be facing and ultimately need to be disclosing on. There are some emerging practices coming. I'm going to update a little bit on some recent events. I'm going to get through this quickly on the next slide. Probably one of the most significant ones, other than I've already mentioned that TCFD has been endorsed by the federal government for Crown corporations and private sector organizations, is an increasing voluntary disclosure in this space. Many of the municipalities across the country, especially the larger ones, are demonstrating some real leadership in terms of the disclosure in this space. And there are some great examples. We've even worked with a number of them, Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto, to create some guidance in this space. In addition to what's happening in Canada, at the international level, the IFRS Foundation is going through a process of determining the establishment of an international sustainability standards board. And what's very interesting on that front is there's a high likelihood that they will commence that process focusing on climate disclosure standards. So this all is happening at a fairly rapid pace. The SEC in the US announced an enforcement task force focused on climate and ESG issues. So it's an area that is emerging and changing and shifting, and really we need to be keeping an eye on it because new opportunities are emerging all the time. And on that, I believe I will bring it to a close.
Gord, wonderful. Thank you so very much. Bohan, over to you, and then you and I will do a close before questions and answers. But Bohan.
Great, thank you very much. I'm Bohan Li. I'm a research associate with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. And I'm going to quickly cover the knowledge gaps and conclude the presentation. So as you can tell from the other presenters, this is an area that's emerged relatively recently and is still evolving very quickly. And so there's going to be a lot of knowledge gaps in this area just because of that. Specifically on the area of climate disclosure, we've heard that investors are increasingly demanding climate-related disclosure, but they're finding that the quality and quantity of climate-related disclosures currently are not necessarily meeting their needs. So there's it's still unknown what sort of policies or initiatives will ultimately encourage that level of disclosure, even though there's a lot of frameworks and standards and methods being worked on to support this. We also don't have a lot of academic research, especially on the effects of climate-related risk disclosures. So in the finance literature, there's actually a broad range of studies on the effects of many types of disclosures, including carbon emissions or pollution disclosures, and corporate social responsibility disclosures, and financial risk disclosures in general. And broadly, they find that these are informative and that they can actually improve the corporate performance, both in environmental performance and also their economic performance. But again, because climate-related risk disclosures are a very new field, there's very little work done on that. So on the area of climate finance, as we discussed, there's a very large finance gap. And so there's still some questions around how to increase investments in climate resilience and low carbon projects. And again, as Maryam discussed, there's a lot of work being done in this field. It's still unclear what combination of these policies, frameworks, standards, and methods will ultimately close this gap. Just some areas in the academic literature that I want to highlight. There is some recent studies on the effectiveness of green bonds. There's some potential evidence that they might be slightly cheaper than other bonds, but it's a very, very small effect, and it's still really unclear. And it might also potentially improve environmental performance for issuing companies. And there's still significant gaps in the empirical literature on the effects of insurance to encourage investment, for example, through insurance premium discounts. So that's something that, speaking with practitioners in the field, it seems like it's really important for homeowners. When people talk to them and encourage them to make their home more resilient, homeowners tend to ask about discounts on their insurance, but academic studies are very few in this field. And finally, in climate litigation, there is potential for more climate-related litigation in Canada, both for the public sector as well as private sector. And as Pat discussed, several key issues relating to climate, the Canadian Charter of Rights, and government policy that are still actively being reviewed by Canadian courts in several jurisdictions. So in conclusion, the main takeaway from our chapter is that the financial risks and opportunities of climate change can encourage climate adaptation. And this is in three main areas. So on climate disclosure, this is key in allowing the assessment of how entities manage their climate risks. And as we've discussed, there's increasing usage of the TCFD framework, and there's increasing investor demand for climate disclosures. In the field of climate finance, there is an investment gap for the transition to a climate resilient and low carbon economy. And financial markets and asset owners face obstacles for investment, and there's a lot of development in this area to reduce those obstacles. And finally, in the area of climate litigation, potential litigation risk exists for private and public entities. And actual or threatened litigation may compel or otherwise motivate entities to undertake climate adaptation. So thank you for attending our presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Paul to moderate our Q&A.
Thank you, Bohan. Bohan, can you turn off the slides and then you can put up everybody's cameras? People can share their videos if they feel like it and have the bandwidth, but I'll do what I can here. Are we able to let everybody show their cameras or just our speakers? I'm not sure how the process works. So anyway, thank you all. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you everybody for squeezing into a short period of time a great deal of work. A reminder for everyone, this is one chapter of the report that Natural Resources Canada will be releasing in about a couple weeks' time. And there's a lot more information than we were able to touch on today. So I really hope that you will be watching for that report. Read what we spoke about in terms of disclosure, finance, and litigation. And there's a lot of other great material in the other chapters when it becomes available. So do watch for that coming out in about a couple weeks' time directly from the Government of Canada. And thank you for being here with some time. So I've grabbed a few of the questions that everybody should have seen through the questions and answers. I'm going to start with Gordon and work my way through everybody here. And Maryam, I'll invite you in a little bit later to bring in a question as well. And we have, I've lost my clock here, but about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes here. So we'll go rather quickly. Gordon, you touched on this is a business issue, that climate change has been an environmental issue for a long time, but this is now a business issue as well. And you mentioned that most businesses are affected by climate change. And the comment was, aren't all businesses affected by climate change? Do you just want to just build a little bit about why this is a business issue and your comments on Christine's intervention about aren't all businesses affected?
Yes, well, thank you very much. And thanks to Christine for asking the question. I think clearly climate change is an issue for basically all sectors and all business issues. Shouldn't say most. Some of them are being impacted more than others. Many are being already impacted. It's not as though it's something in the future because climate is changing. We're seeing more extreme events. We're seeing things. And these things can come through in a variety of ways, affecting depending on what the business sector is. So that for each sector, there will be different ways and times of impacts and different response strategies that we need to work together on to get a more effective response. So I could go into all details, but that would take up all the time we've got available. So I'll stop there and just say that, yes, it's much broader. We need to be able to deal it and work together. And we need to bring, as we talked about in the report that Paul and I helped with 20 some others to write, bring together sectors to work on these things together in a way that makes, let's say, economic as well as societal sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. And again, just for all listeners, this was our first recommendation on behalf of the team before we said all the others. Climate change is a business issue. There's no more, we put a few more words around that, but it's a business issue. It's an environmental issue. It's a policy issue. It's got all these other dimensions, but it's now a business issue. And I'm not sure that the science or the literature would have said that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but it is today. And probably will stay that way for a while. Thanks, Gordon. Gord, I think there were more questions about disclosure than any other topic, and I won't try to read them all. Unfortunately, we just don't have time. I'm going to sneak in two here for you. One is from Chris. Gord, you focused on financial disclosure. That's where your background is. Chris happens to be, as I understand it, looking from a real estate perspective. Aren't you disclosing when you take on responsibilities to buy a house or whatever? There's other aspects of disclosure that aren't all financial disclosure. Do some of the findings we're sharing about how disclosure can be important or is important go beyond just financial disclosure to other elements of disclosure? And then the second, a tough question for you here, Gord, all of the questions are tough, from Lynn. Does disclosure drive action? That's the whole point here. And what can you share as many? I think Lynn is looking for action. Where can your views take us in terms of does disclosure actually result in action? Yeah, it was a longer question. I'm picking up part of the spirit of what Lynn was sharing and some others. Over to you, Gord.
Oh, those are questions that could take some time. I'll be honest, I know I focused a lot on the financial reporting side of things, but disclosure incorporates a broad consideration of the risks and opportunities, the descriptions related to it. Oftentimes it'll be the issues that are arising even before it has a financial impact that has to be disclosed early on. But where the benefit is in disclosing and where possible doing the assessment of the impact it can have financially on the organization in the longer term. That's what's driving the financial reporting side of it. On the voluntary side, when you look at the TCFD outline, it's in terms of where some of the disclosure gets reported. So as trying to really make the disclosure core in the way that organizations are reporting. So it's not on the fringe, it becomes core to how the organization is reporting its results. And when you look at the TCFD framework, it's looking at issues of governance and how the organization is assessing and managing the climate-related risks and opportunities. The strategy side, describing how the risks and opportunities that are going to actually impact the medium, short-term, long-term elements of the organization. How organizations are managing the risks. So there's a lot to the disclosure that goes way beyond just the financial elements. But the financial element is key because so much of that drives the core regulatory reporting side of it. On the, I am a firm believer that disclosure can actually drive behavioral change. I'm an accountant by training, and the whole issue of transparency, accountability, when organizations are being asked by whether a regulatory requirement or by stakeholders to disclose the activities that they're undertaking to manage and address climate-related matters, reporting essentially happens after a range of activities are being undertaken. So the way it should happen, it may seem a little bit backwards, but by being required or asked to disclose their actions and the results of their actions on their reporting side, it inevitably should lead to the way organizations are behaving in the first place. And if they're disclosing that, frankly, they're not doing anything, then increasingly stakeholders are going to be asking them to do something about it until it gets to the point where their disclosure is demonstrating the action that they're undertaking.
Thank you, Gord. Excellent questions in the tight time we have here, so thank you. And Lynn, part of what I would build on Gord's comment, when you get a chance to read the full section that the team and Gord wrote, we talk about some of these things being relatively new. And so I think the team is very optimistic disclosure will drive action, but this is still a new space. We don't have standards, we don't have agreement, we don't have a lot of disclosure quite yet, but we're optimistic. Maryam, do you have a comment here on this issue? Maryam, you're on mute.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is really the heart of the matter is, disclosure is disclosure, but ultimately, is it driving action? And I want to tell you that maybe beyond Canada and including many institutions in Canada, we are going far beyond this issue of TCFD. So companies have taken a lot of the experiments from regulatory bodies and others, done a bit of analysis, tried to disclose, and they have realized that all those resources should be spent on risk assessment and analysis. That is precisely decision relevant. So I can tell you right now, what I call it is phase 2 of rethinking disclosure and reporting to add more granularity, for example, to TCFD recommendations. One initiative is an industry-wide initiative by the insurance industry, where companies are coming together through an international task force through the Geneva Association to completely rethink disclosure and turning it on its head, starting from what decisions in the company I make that's impacted by physical and transition risk in time horizons looking forward. How do I go about thinking about the risk and how do I measure it? What scenarios? Because the conversation is shifting from just disclosure for sake of checking a box to investing in analysis to empower decision making. So I would say that conversation and development of methodologies is really shifting, and there are several of Canadian companies that are actively involved in that. So I think we will see in the next year or two that you see this conversation is not just about disclosure, but decision useful disclosure that can enable action, and we will see some challenges to the methodologies and rethink of those methodologies along that precise objective.
Thank you, Maryam. Maryam, I have a question for you. And then after the question I have for you, Pat, Maryam has a question for you, Pat. So I'll invite Maryam to do the question for you. Maryam, there are no questions on finance. My question for you, what does that mean that there are no questions on finance? Do you interpret that as we have a lot of people on the line here and finance is completely sorted out, there's no issues? Or finance, Pat stole the word sexy. Is finance not as sexy as litigation? Anyway, there are no questions. What do you think that means?
Excellent. Maryam? So I think precisely finance is the sexiest topic right now because with the lack of public policy action and related regulation and legislative action to sort of enable transitioning, people like Mark Carney and co realize that if we don't transition properly, that could become a major financial stability issue, not only to our economy globally. So this is why the whole world of finance is working to take action and try to push this area. So I would say in the absence of, clear public policy and approach, finance, financial regulations, and courts have become the 3 tools to push for action. And I think the field of finance is so complex, when you think about the regulatory side, the tools to actually raise funds, how would the world of public and private, it's very complex. So I would like to interpret this as a complex area that needs to be figured out. And here is what I always tell people. When people think about investing in transitioning, everybody talks about impact investing, responsible investing. when you look at the portfolio of an institutional investor, let's say it's a portfolio of 6 trillion in investments, maybe 1% of that is dedicated to impact and responsible investing as we've known it. My interest and the world of finance's interest is how we transition the mainstream investment part into supporting the transition into low carbon. And I think all the regulatory changes, all the restructuring of how you finance these things is a topic of how to direct mainstream finance. So I would urge everybody to go and read the report of expert panel on sustainable finance and really push on some of those messages in our country, because we really move on this. Too many times I go to international conferences and large institutional investors say, I'm not interested to invest in Canadian economy anymore. It's too dirty. That's quote unquote. So the money we need to raise for Canada is going to come from Canadian investors and global investors. And this is something that we need to make our transitioning appealing and investable grade to raise those kind of capital. That's what I say for now. And I say we have a lot of work ahead of us to go there. Perfect. Thanks, Maryam. Maryam, you have a question for Pat. Pat, I have 2 questions for you, actually. You know that at the Geneva Association, we just released a report, a global report about litigation. So I have 2 questions for you. First thing is, you very beautifully categorized the sources of litigation. One source that we see coming out in the United States, and I want to quote, of 1,800 cases reported as of now, 1,400 cases are in the United States. I mean, that's how prominent litigation is there. We are seeing a range of litigations against climate action. So litigation against governments and corporations for building large green projects like big wind farms and solar farms. And the litigation's basis is impacting nature and livelihood of Indigenous peoples, as well as environmental risks. So where do you see the trends in Canada if we start transitioning? And then the second question is, globally, as certain cases are becoming successful, other jurisdictions are using that. It's truly a global phenomenon. To use a case, for example, Urgenda in Holland, to make an appeal in their own jurisdictions. How do you think developments in the global litigation landscape is going to impact Canada?
So thanks, Maryam. Let me start by saying, and this is going to premise both questions. There's an old saying that there's nothing new under the sun. And in the context of both questions you asked, that is the truth. In Canada, we have had litigation going back well over 5, 6, 7 years, focused not from an anti-climate change perspective, but from basically a negative response to certain types of renewable energy. Renewable energy, in fact, has been a lightning rod I think, across the country, particularly wind projects. There are, I wouldn't even want to count them, but there have been many, many cases brought against wind developers, some of which have resulted in wind projects basically being shut down. The basis for those complaints have usually been either health related. There are a number of public interest groups who feel that wind has negative impact on the health of those who live near the turbines or their animals, farm animals. And the other has been endangered species. And for those of you who live in Ontario, you'll probably remember with some affection the headline in the Star when a group basically brought a very successful case to shut down the development of a wind turbine because it was displacing habitat for the Blandings turtle. And there was a very amusing picture of a Blandings turtle with its very smiling face looking at the camera, and the headline was "Turtle Mightier Than Developer." So we have seen these cases for years now. As I said, they're mostly focused on wind. There are some cases that I'm aware of where people aren't concerned about solar developments, because when a massive solar development goes in, it basically covers the landscape and can choke off habitat for for endangered species. We have not seen, at least we've seen really with the indigenous the indigenous side. I think we see First Nations very much involved with renewable energy. There are many projects coming forward in which First Nations are active proponents of renewable energy. So I cannot think immediately of a trend of cases against. But I do want to say all these cases are not anti-climate. They're focused specifically on the types of infrastructure that are going into these areas and the effects on people. On your second question, I'm often a proponent of what I believe to be the case that Canada is often ahead of other jurisdictions, and we Canadians often don't get credit for being ahead or for launching ideas. The agenda case that you mentioned was a case in the Netherlands in which an NGO successfully got a Dutch court to basically rule that the government of the Netherlands had a duty to its citizens with respect to certain types of climate adaptation action. It was what I call a rights-based case. It focused on the Dutch Constitution, and it focused on a treaty, which was an EU treaty. And those things, of course, are not part of Canadian law. But I will say that for Canada, we had cases very early on. And in fact, I didn't get into these in my discussion, but there were early cases from roughly 15 years ago in which NGOs had sought to cause the government to take action on climate change. These are the cases around Kyoto and Canada's participation or lack thereof in Kyoto. And courts at that time dropped a little bit of a hint that the Charter of Rights might be something that people could look at going forward. And I think that certainly Canadian academics were looking at the Charter as a possible source of litigation at about the same time that the agenda case was starting. So I think the whole idea of rights-based litigation, whether it's human rights, whether it's constitutional rights, whether it's Charter of Rights and Freedom, that's been a huge area, and certainly around the world we keep seeing this is popping up in various countries. In terms of whether there are new whether ideas are going to feed into Canada. Of course, you can never say no, but I think the reality is when we're looking at all these developments outside the country, we have to remember that cases that are decided in one legal system are not necessarily going to have any impact because the laws are different, and our courts are not required to take notice of decisions in different legal systems for presidential purposes. And you see that even in Europe, where you see an Irish court writing, an Irish court was asked to look at their climate legislation, and the court said, look, that agenda case was based on Dutch tort law. That I don't even know what that is. He basically used words to that effect and said, I can't apply that holding. In Canada, I would say this, we are generally a less litigious country than certainly the United States. That's been the case for years and years. Is that part of our psyche? Maybe. But certainly from a cost perspective, where there's established law, it's tough to get people to bring litigation when they know it's simply going to be for public purposes. In Canada, it's tough to get law firms to take on cases pro bono. And of course, that's very different than the States, where contingent fees are the order of the day. It's just a very different landscape. So
thanks, Pat. Gonna have to shut you off here really quickly before I turn to Bohan, and then we're going to close. Maryam, there's a question for you from Lynn in the questions and answers. There's a question for you, Maryam, from Brennan in the questions and answers. Pat, there's a question for you from Claudia in the questions and answers. I'll send it your way. And Gord, there's a question in the chat from Harshan. Gord, it would be great if you could look at that. Gordon, I don't see one right now for you, but there's several questions in there that I didn't get to. So, but we won't have time to field them for the group if you're able to send an email back or a note back. As we're almost out of time here, Bohan, unfortunately, this is part of being the youngest member of the team. You sometimes are the last one to get your turn. Bohan, there's not a specific question, I think, for you from our guests. what was it like to be the youngest member of this team working on this issue? How did you feel about the science and the knowledge for addressing the broad, important issue of disclosure, finance, and litigation? Bohan?
Yeah, thank you. So my background is in economics, and it was great to actually work with so many experts, you know, who have so much experience in these fields, and just learning a lot, you know, both about the writing process and as well with the whole, you know, about these topics. And I think I've certainly got a greater appreciation for this, and it's been great to actually write this paper with all of you guys.
Thank you, Bohan. Wonderful. And it was great to work with everybody here. So we just got about 2 minutes left before we formally have to wrap up for today. Just a reminder, Natural Resources Canada will be releasing its climate change report in a couple weeks' time. They will determine the specific time and location, so keep watching for that. We're very excited about it coming out. It will include the chapter that this writing team put together, dealing with climate disclosure, finance, and litigation. But it's got much more in it. So do watch for that report to come out, and there'll be more details. This particular video will be on the ICLR website in a day or two. Today was recorded, and we will put it up as today's session went. It was wonderful to have everybody from the writing team able to make time today. All the members of the writing team are volunteers, as is everybody else as part of the NRCan process. This is because of our passion for the science and helping Canadians understand climate change and what it means from so many different dimensions. And it was so exciting for us to be able to bring this topic into the dialogue. This is not part of, I would suggest, the mainstream science dialogue in Canada. Some of these issues are just emerging, and we're so excited that this is part of the Canadian dialogue. It's not yet in the IPCC, it's not yet in the US literature, it's in the Canadian. So we're leading the way yet again in terms of taking some of these important messages out. Behind what we shared with you is lots of work going on, and you heard just parts of it. People really dedicated, some on the line here, but a lot of other people really dedicated to this area, trying to really make a difference. Our overriding message, climate is a business issue, and to help drive decisions to be better will be disclosure. Not everything's sorted out yet, but we've come quite a way, and there's a lot to be proud of, but there's more to come. Keep your eye on it. Finance, figure out, I'm an economist as well, where the money comes from really matters, and tracking that, there's more alternatives, more choices. The finance questions are complicated, but understanding finance really makes a difference about whether we make progress, don't make progress, how things happen. And litigation, holding people to account. And it's a complicated field, and understanding specifically what's happening in Canada was part of what we were able to share with you today. So thank you to everybody on the panel for making time to write this report and be here today and share in your own words where we are. And thank you to everybody for signing in and joining us, and for your comments and for your feedback. So with that, on behalf of the writing team and on behalf of ICLR, thank you one and all.